Okay, so we're diving into Mark Manson and this, gotta admit, kind of provocatively titled book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
Yeah, the title, it's definitely an attention grabber.
Right. But what we're really after here, and what I think Manson gets at, is this kind of practical enlightenment.
Yeah.
Like, how do we actually live a good life?
Yeah.
And it's not about being a jerk. It's about figuring out what truly matters.
You know, it's interesting because Manson blends this really raw, like almost shocking honesty with some really deep psychological and philosophical insight.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from the heavy stuff at all. He jumps right into our fear of death, what he calls death terror, and how it kind of secretly drives so much of what we do.
It's like this underlying current pushing us towards what he calls these immortality projects.
Which are basically
The legacies we want to leave behind, the things that, in the face of death, we hope will give our lives meaning.
And this is where it gets really practical, I think, because those immortality projects, they're essentially our values, right?
Exactly.
He uses this example of Dave Mustaine, the musician from Megadeth.
Oh, yeah, great example.
Super successful, right?
Hugely successful. I mean, talk about a metal god. But here's the thing. Early in his career, Mustaine gets kicked out of Metallica.
Oh, wow.
And even decades later, after achieving incredible success with Megadeth, he still kind of measured his worth against Metallica.
Really? Wow. So even after you've made it, you can still feel like you haven't, like it's never enough.
That's exactly Manson's point. It's a cautionary tale about, being careful what you wish for, but also about choosing the right metrics for success.
It's like, be careful what values you're chasing after, because they might not actually lead to fulfillment.
Right. And on the flip side, Manson talks about Pete Best.
The drummer the Beatles fired, like right before they hit it big.
The one and only. Now, you'd think Best would be this bitter, resentful guy.
Yeah, you'd think so.
But here's where it gets interesting. He actually finds more contentment in a simpler life. He focuses on family, on personal fulfillment, instead of, chasing fame and fortune.
So he redefines success on his own terms.
Exactly. And it's a perfect illustration of Manson's point. You're going to die anyway.
We are. Eventually, yeah.
So why waste your precious time and energy on things that don't actually matter to you?
Okay, I like that. So it's about becoming, what does he say, the architect of your own belief system.
Yes. Instead of letting your brain just run on autopilot, accepting whatever stories it throws your way.
Oh, totally.
Manson talks about how our brains are constantly distorting reality, often without us even realizing it.
Right, like we misremember things, we misinterpret events. It's just what our brains do.
Exactly. And he uses this example of a woman named Meredith, and it's wild.
Okay, what happened with Meredith?
So she had this really vivid memory of being abused, and it shaped her whole life, her relationships, her worldview, everything.
Wow, that's intense.
It is. But here's the twist. The memory turned out to be false.
What?
It never actually happened.
Are you serious?
Completely serious.
Wow, so she built this whole reality, this whole understanding of herself based on something that never even happened. That's kind of terrifying when you think about it.
It is, and it highlights how our desire for certainty, for an explanation, can lead us down the wrong path.
And how easily our brains can trick us into believing those stories even if they're not true.
Exactly. And it's why Manson emphasizes cultivating self-skepticism, constantly questioning your assumptions, even the ones that feel the most true.
Because those are usually the ones we need to question the most.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this isn't about slapping on a fake smile and pretending everything is perfect. Manson's all about embracing discomfort, even failure, as crucial for growth.
He talks about how teenagers with OCD, for example, they can learn to manage their condition, not by, eliminating their anxieties.
Which it would be impossible, right?
Exactly, but by reframing their values around those anxieties.
Oh, interesting. So it's not about getting rid of the discomfort. It's about changing your relationship to it.
It's about changing how you respond to it, how you let it define you.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like action is a big part of this.
It is. And this ties into one of Manson's most practical points, I think. And that's the idea that action often creates motivation, not the other way around.
Oh, I like that.
You see, we often wait to feel inspired, but sometimes you just have to start, even if it's messy.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that, waiting for inspiration to strike.
Right. We all do it.
But sometimes you just have to take that first step.
Exactly. And Manson himself admits to this, He spent years bouncing around the world, chasing these new experiences, but eventually he realized the power of commitment.
Oh, man, too.
To relationships, to a craft, to a place.
So instead of constantly chasing new things, He found freedom in choosing something and sticking with it.
It's kind of ironic, right?
It is. You find freedom by limiting your options, by going deep instead of wide.
Exactly. And he talks about learning this in Russia, of all places.
What, like Siberia?
Well, not quite Siberia, but he talks about how he was initially put off by the bluntness of Russian culture.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. Like
Yeah.
it's very direct, very little sugarcoating.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
coming from a culture where communication is more indirect, he was kind of thrown off at first.
Sure.
But then he had this aha moment where he realized that this directness, this lack of pretense, was incredibly liberating.
It's like ripping off a Band-Aid.
Mm,
It might sting at first, but then there's this huge sense of relief.
that's a great way to put it. And that's what Manson's getting at. True freedom often lies in letting go of the need to please everyone, to be liked by everyone.
It's about being authentic, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
Exactly. And that's a really good segue into, well, we'll get to that. So, where were we? Ah, yes, Manson's point about questioning your values. He uses this really interesting psychological experiment to kind of illustrate this point about how our brains find meaning.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me. What's this experiment all about?
So picture this. They put people in a room, right? And there are all these buttons and this light.
Okay, sounds simple enough.
And they tell these folks, figure out the sequence of buttons to make the light flash. Each time you get it to flash, you get points.
Oh, I get it. So it's like a game.
Exactly. Like a real-life video game.
People probably get really competitive.
Oh, totally. But here's the catch. The points are completely random.
Wait, what? You mean there's no pattern to the buttons?
Nope, none whatsoever.
So there's no way to win.
There's no way to win. But here's the thing, and this is what's so fascinating. Even when they tell people, hey, by the way, the points are random,
Yeah.
most people are convinced that they've figured out a pattern. They've got these elaborate strategies, right? They're clinging to this sense of control.
Even though it's an illusion.
Total illusion. But that's how our brains work, right?
Are always searching for meaning, even when there's nothing there.
Exactly. Our brains are wired to find meaning even when there is none. And this tendency to create narratives, even false ones, it kind of bleeds into how we view our own lives.
Yeah.
Our successes, our failures,
Our values.
especially our values.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yep.
So we might be clinging to values that are based on what? Faulty logic, outdated information.
Exactly. Just like Meredith and that false memory we talked about, our desire to have this compelling story, to be the exception, it can really warp our perception.
So how do we break free from that? How do we know if we're clinging to a story that's not even true?
Well, Manson would say it's about actively seeking out doubt.
Doubt, really? That sounds a little counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It might sound kind of strange, but doubt, it's actually the engine of growth.
Okay, explain that.
Okay.
How does doubting yourself lead to growth?
Well, it forces you to confront those, potentially limiting beliefs. It makes you consider alternative perspectives.
So instead of just assuming we're right, we should be actively looking for where we might be wrong.
Exactly.
It's a tough one.
It is tough. But think about it this way. Certainty often leads to stagnation.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
It creates this illusion of control, right? And then it prevents you from adapting, from growing.
It's like the difference between like a flowing river and a stagnant pond.
Right.
Right. One is full of life, constantly changing. The other is, well, kind of gross.
It's a perfect analogy. And this whole embracing uncertainty thing, it's especially important when it comes to how you view success and failure.
Because sometimes your biggest failures, they can lead to.
Your greatest growth.
Didn't Manson experience this firsthand? Like with his career?
He did. He talks about graduating from college during the Great Recession.
Oof. Talk about bad timing.
Right. Most people would see that as this massive setback.
Which it is objectively,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. But he actually saw it as an advantage.
How so?
He says he was fortunate, those are words, to start his adult life as a failure
Interesting.
because it removed the fear of hitting rock bottom.
Because he was already there.
Exactly. By embracing failure as a starting point, he freed himself up to experiment, pursue his passions without this, crippling fear of things getting worse.
That is a really interesting way to look at it. So it's like he gave himself permission to take risks
Oh.
because the worst had already happened.
And that's the point he makes about action creating motivation. He didn't wait to feel inspired or ready to start his own business. He just dove in.
Knowing that even if he failed,
It wasn't the end of the world.
right, because he'd already hit that point.
Exactly. For him, the real failure would have been not pursuing those values. Freedom, autonomy, the ability to work on his own terms.
He defined success for himself.
He chose a metric for success that truly resonated with him,
Yeah.
not the ones that society typically dictates.
Which is a powerful reminder for all of us to actually sit down and ask ourselves, what does success mean to me?
100%. And sometimes that means embracing discomfort,
Hmm.
questioning those really deeply ingrained beliefs about what will make us happy.
Like Manson's friend, the party guy.
Mm.
That whole section of the book was so interesting.
Oh, yeah, the party guy. That's such a good example of how unclear boundaries they can just wreak havoc. And not just in romantic relationships, but in, any type of relationship.
Okay, so unclear boundaries, the party guy. Remind me about that connection again.
So Manson, he argues that a lot of relationship problems, they come from this murky sense of responsibility.
Or how?
It's not clear who's responsible for what, whose fault is what. And it becomes this breeding ground for resentment, frustration.
Yeah, I've totally been there. It's like you end up feeling resentful, but you can't even pinpoint why.
Exactly. And he points out these two really common but unhealthy roles that people often fall into, the victim and the savior.
Okay, I've definitely heard him talk about those.
And both of these roles, they're driven by this need to avoid taking responsibility for your own happiness.
So you end up relying on the other person to, what, like complete you?
In a way, yeah, to fill that void.
Which is a recipe for disaster.
100%. So how do you break free from those patterns? How do you actually build a healthy relationship with strong boundaries?
Yeah, what does that even look like?
It comes down to each person taking ownership, right?
Yeah.
Of their own values, their own problems, their own happiness.
So not expecting your partner to fix you.
Exactly. It's about supporting each other's growth, not trying to mold each other into these idealized versions of ourselves.
Which can be tough, right?
Huh.
Because when you really care about someone, you want to help, you want to fix things for them.
Absolutely. But that level of support, genuine support, it requires honesty, even when it's uncomfortable,
Yeah.
even when it means risking rejection.
Ooh, rejection. That's a tough one.
It is. And that takes us to, I think, one of the most challenging but crucial aspects of Manson's whole philosophy, the necessity of rejection.
Not just receiving it, but actually like dishing it out.
Yeah. Being willing to give it. It's about getting comfortable with the word no, about setting those limits that allow for healthy, sustainable relationships.
Because saying yes to everything and everyone
Is a recipe for burnout and resentment. You spread yourself too thin, you betray your own needs, and ultimately it backfires.
you can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Yeah.
Got to take care of yourself first.
Exactly. And that's where Manson's own journey, it's so instructive. He went from this guy who taste experiences all over the world to someone who found real peace, real fulfillment in commitment
Commitment
to his work, his relationships, even just to a place.
He talks about how those amazing experiences, all that travel, it started to feel kind of hollow, right? Like he wasn't really creating anything lasting.
He even says it was like he was collecting experiences instead of actually living a life.
And it was in Russia, of all places.
Right, of all places. That he had this epiphany about honesty, direct communication.
Yeah, he talks about how he was initially put off by that directness in Russian culture.
Which is so different from that more, indirect style he was used to.
But then he realizes that directness, that lack of pretense, it was actually really refreshing.
Liberating even.
Exactly. So how do we get better at that? At being more direct, more comfortable with rejection, with saying no.
It starts with those non-negotiable values, those things that are truly important to you.
Figuring out what those are.
And then having the courage to actually build your life around them, even if it means disappointing other people or, going against the grain.
It's about choosing your flex carefully.
Exactly.
I love how Manson brings it all back around to this central theme, like we are all going to die.
The ultimate equalizer.
Right. It really puts everything into perspective.
It does. And, while that might seem morbid to some people, Manson argues that embracing this inevitability, it can be incredibly liberating.
Because when you're no longer consumed by that fear of death,
you're free. Free to focus on what actually matters. To live a life that's aligned with your values, even if it's not always easy or conventional.
it's about leaving a legacy, not of, material possessions or fleeting achievements.
But of a life that was really lived. A life of intention, courage, and a healthy dose of not giving a feck about the things that don't truly matter.
That's such a great way to put it. It's about embracing the freedom that comes from choosing what you care about and then, really going for it. So there you have it, folks, our deep dive into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck. It's a philosophy that really encourages us to confront those fears, question our assumptions, and ultimately live a life that's true to ourselves. And sometimes that means, being a little uncomfortable, making some people a little uncomfortable. But ultimately, it's about embracing this messy, unpredictable, beautiful journey of life.